So if you're online and you see the phrase music theory, try replacing it with the phrase the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians and see if it still makes sense in context. Here is an article that claims to explain the genius of Lady Gaga using the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians. The article then goes on to highlight her song Bad Romance's use of the raised leading tone in a minor key, which was very popular in 18th century Europe. Very cool. This is a class that you can take all about the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians, and the way that you can tell is by looking at the course catalog, which has a lot of tonal harmony in it, which was very popular in 18th century Europe. This is a thread on the electronic music producer deadmau5's subreddit, which asks, does Joel use the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians? Well, no, he doesn't use the same vocabulary that Mozart did, and he is very clear in interviews that he uses a different skill set.
Do you self-identify as a tech guy or as a musical artist at this point?
I think I'm more tech than, Mozart or whatever the hell.
What about need help understanding how this progression fits in with the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians? How many of you guys know the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians? Did the Beatles know much about the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians? Etc., etc. You get the point. We see this all the time in popular media. We've been trained to see the two of them as the same thing, even though the analytical models, the music theory, that might help in understanding the music of Beethoven might not help in understanding rock music, or country, or R&B, or electronic dance music, or any of the styles of music that you, the person watching this video, are statistically more likely to listen to and make part of your life than the music of Beethoven. Let me put it this way. What most people think of as music theory actually does a pretty bad job of describing musical practice in most styles of music. Instead, this has kind of been used as a means of comparing all music from all people across the globe to the stylistic practice of a select few musicians. These guys versus, say, I don't know, these guys. So, can you spot the difference between the tonal composers on the left and the tonal composers on the right? That's right. The ones on the left are American. The ones on the right are German. And they clearly wrote the better music, which is why we study them. They clearly have the superior music. They clearly have a superior culture. They are individuals of genius who rise above the degenerate masses and their degenerate music. They are... Part 1. The white racial frame of music theory.
Hi, my name is Philip Ewell. I am an associate professor of music theory at Hunter College here in New York City.
Dr. Ewell gave the keynote speech at the annual Society for Music Theory conference.
Our white racial frame believes that the music and music theories of white persons represent the best framework for music theory.
It's part of everything that we do, white racial framing in music. All of the materials that we use in our music theory classes, for sure, are so deeply indebted to whiteness.
In his paper, The White Racial Frame of Music Theory, Dr. Ewell says that music theory can be seen as a racial ideology in which the views and ideas of white persons are held to be more significant than the views and ideas of non-whites. Woo, okay. Racial ideology. That sounds like some critical race theory jargon, and as we've learned recently, that is un-American, so I don't want to talk about that too much on this channel lest we be accused of un-American activities. So to try and figure out why American music theory is not built around these American composers, we're going to focus on just the music. And we already kind of have done that. We saw how music theory in popular culture can simply just mean the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians. And there are some musical elements which are unique to that style that are not shared in other styles, which are oddly prioritized.
One thing I like to talk about, which, because it's so funny, is figured bass.
Figured bass is a system where numbers indicate intervals and chromatic alterations above bass notes. It's kind of like a 17th century shorthand, like chord symbols, a means of getting by on the gig. Musicians would read off of figured bass charts and improvise their parts, which was a practice called basso continuo, or simply continuo.
And as a cellist who's played a lot of continuo with some really good Baroque groups, figured bass is something I live and breathe. I love figured bass, I understand it intimately. When we think about having it in our music theory textbooks, are you kidding me?
Here is a music theory textbook from 1725, Johann Fuchs's Gradus ad Parnassum, which honestly does not look that much different from a textbook from 2011, Harmony and Voice Leading by Aldwer and Schachter. Nothing has really changed in 300 years, even though music has changed quite a lot.
Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov wrote a harmony textbook, the most famous harmony textbook ever written in Russia, probably. And he said, you know what, music is so crazy these days, I'm not even going to put figured bass in here because it's kind of a waste of time. It's outdated. We don't need it anymore. That was 1884, Adam.
Seriously, check this out. This is what Rimsky-Korsakov, the Flight of the Bumblebee guy, wrote. In most of the existing manuals of harmony, we find rules for reading the now obsolete figured bass, but little or no practical advice for harmonizing melodies or selecting chords. 140 years ago. I mean, might as well be explaining this book or this book or this book. Like, nothing has changed in 140 years.
We don't have to perpetrate a system which is, once you actually look at it, kind of ridiculous.
Figured bass is totally useless in understanding any kind of music that isn't Western or tonal. Instead, it's a tool designed to understand the style of music from one kind of people.
I now refer to it as yet another method that the white racial frame of music theory can police and enforce whiteness. They'll never say that. What they'll say is, oh, but it's historical and it can help with other things. There's a reason that they're going to give for everything, for keeping things the way they are.
That's how it's justified anyway in the course catalog for AP AP harmonic style of 18th century European musicians. But let's say that you were enrolled in AP Spanish, and the way that you were taught Spanish in this course was by studying 300-year-old Spanish grammar. Now, studying these archaic tenses might be interesting. It's definitely historical. The way that they spoke Spanish back then definitely has influenced the way that Spanish is spoken around the world. And I don't know, if you already know a little bit of Spanish, maybe it might be useful for understanding Don Quixote or whatever, but is it useful? Is it practical for having conversations in Spanish in everyday life? Of course not. You might want to think about, in this entirely hypothetical scenario involving Spanish, why that practicality of having conversations in Spanish with cultures around the world is being sacrificed in the name of 300-year-old European Spanish grammar.
What they are way more loath to acknowledge is the race, the whiteness behind it, and how that actually plays into their own thinking about this very history that we're talking about. When you think about the country, the United States, and you think about how structural race has always been, it wouldn't make any sense at all if a musical way, a methodology for how we can envision and teach and experience music were not white racially framed as well in a country that itself is white racially framed. People are loath to admit that any culture with a music, which is every culture, has not only a rich musical tradition, but a rich music theoretical tradition.
Well then, welcome to this episode of the Basic Theory of Indian Music with me, Anuja Kamath.
Part 2 minor. You know there's other music theory, right? Anuja Kamath is a young singer that has a fantastic YouTube channel that goes over the basics of North Indian classical music, the concepts necessary to perform it, and just generally its vibe. She covers fairly technical things from tuning and temperament.
Each swara has a range of frequencies to itself in which it can operate. This range is called swara kshetra.
To ornamentation.
Let me introduce you to the concept of zamzama. This is found a lot in Maharashtrian and Punjabi folk songs.
To rhythm.
Tal is made up of specific syllables and specific beats. Lay is the distance between each beat.
And of course the intricacies of melody as expressed through rag, or ragas, if you're Anglo like me.
Rag means a melody which is used to express a feeling.
The basic structure of what I would call the major scale is the same in North Indian music.
Sa re ga ma pa dha ni sa. Same is applicable for a Western song.
And so Anuja is able to sing Western songs using Indian solfege, like the one song from Twilight that I actually kind of like. I don't know why people dislike it. Do people dislike it? It's a nice song. Whatever.
I have died every day waiting for you. Ga pa ga dha re sa.
All of the subjects that she covers have rough parallels in Western music theory. In fact, she often does cross-cultural comparisons, which serve to highlight the similarities as well as the differences between Western music and North Indian classical music.
The phrase Nirega forms the identity of Yaman. So instead of taking Sa Re Ga Ma Pa, you take Ni Re Ga Ma Pa. Every rag has a chalan. There are rules when it comes to combination of notes. For Western music students, this is exactly the difference between the Western concept of scale or mode and the Indian concept of rag.
So, Anuja is using Western theory as a foil to North Indian theory, as a means of understanding both of them a little bit better. That's something that we just don't do in the West. Like, even if you are a trained musician, chances are the past 2 minutes of information has been completely new to you.
Let me introduce you to the concept of Zamzama.
What if that's something that we did, though? What if that cross-cultural relationship was kind of built into the way that we learned music theory?
Approach a music theory textbook the way that they all more or less start. They talk about rhythm and meter and pitch and scale. You can begin by putting out music theory and talk about Asiatic or African or Middle East. You can talk about the Americas, South America, ideas that came from all over the planet in terms of pitch, rhythm, meter, and probably most importantly, scale. Ragas and makams immediately come to mind. And then you could pivot into sections of the music theory that you and I were taught. So instead of having it be 50 examples by Bach, why not have 2 examples by Bach?
I love me some Bach. Bach is awesome. But he was a relatively obscure composer in his day and rarely performed in the years after his death. It was only through the efforts of people like Felix Mendelssohn that his music kind of became the staple of the repertoire. That archival work necessary to preserve the legacy of the few people of color and women working within European music at the time just never happened.
Why not have a woman composer in your example from 1700? Why not have a POC if you have a Renaissance example?
And so partially as a result, we have a very limited and monochromatic canon. Definitely go check out 12 Tone's video on the classical canon if you haven't already. It's a great video that definitely helps put the music of Beethoven and Bach in some historical perspective.
And then, right there on page 152, boom, you got an example by Beethoven. Why not? He deserves a seat at the table. He wasn't a bad composer. As I said in my blog, he was an above average composer. By golly, happy to play him, happy to hear him. I don't have a problem with Beethoven. I have a problem with what happened after he died in 1827.
In his article on the composer Florence Price, a black woman, the classical music critic Alex Ross warns,
reducing music history to a pageant of masters is, at bottom, lazy. We stick with the known in order to avoid the hard work of exploring the unknown.
What we've done is we've taken musical examples that represent probably not even 0.1% of the world's music. We have claimed that it is music theory, not Western, not white music theory, not even Western music theory for music. Kind of for the world, right? I mean, that's just so absolutely illogical. It doesn't make any sense at all. A 5/7 going to 1, fine. The 7th goes down by a step, sure. And you actually contextualize it and you have other music. Oh yeah, do you remember the raga we studied in chapter 2? Let's think about it now in relation to this piece by a Renaissance composer, maybe Lusitano, who was mixed race like me.
let's put this into practice to see how we might do this kind of cross-cultural theory analysis. Why does Anuja singing the rag Shuddha Kalyan sound similar to Kathleen Battle singing Xavier Montsalvage's song Ninge Ninge? These 2 examples come from different cultures and so use different musical theory, but they arrive at a similar sounding kind of melody. They have the same scale degrees, or swara. In the West, we would say do, la, sol, mi, and in India, you'd say sa, da, pa, ga. And they both use the ornamentation of portamento, or meaned, that bending, sliding effect.
Meaned is nothing but a glide, a smooth glide from one note to the other.
Western theory would probably consider these notes a subset of the major pentatonic scale, but Rag Shuddha Kalyan is a little bit more specific. The meaned, that bending, is actually an integral part of the rag itself.
For example, Rag Shuddha Kalyan. It has meaned from sa to dha and pa to ga. That is the essential identity of Rag Shuddha Kalyan. So, sa dha pa ga.
Portamento is more an expressive technique in the West. It's not quite as foundational. You can have the pentatonic scale without the bending. In traditional North Indian classical music, different rags are associated with different times of the day, and Shuddha Kalyan is an evening rag. Ninge Ninge is a lullaby, and lullabies are traditionally sung in the evening, although the pentatonic scale doesn't really have that kind of temporal relationship. In the West, scales don't have to be performed at certain times of day, but that is kind of an interesting coincidence.
Many different peoples have taken the idea of rhythm and meter and pitch and scale, for example, and done many different things with it. And you fold in the idea of Western tonality as one of those things, which it is. And it has been influenced by all of those things, and vice versa. There's no question about that. All of a sudden, you just get a beautifully contextualized picture of music and music theory. Western music theory will continue to be part of the curricula, as it should be, because it is such an integral part of the American musical experience.
It really comes down to a matter of perspective. Perspective aids in understanding. And even within the Western canon, we generally have only looked at music from this one perspective, when there are in fact many. Part 3, minor 7 flat 5. People who are not white men.
George Russell is a teacher as well as a composer. You were associated specifically with adventures in tonality.
George Russell was a mixed-race jazz musician who wrote a very influential jazz education method called the Lydian chromatic concept, otherwise known as
The Lydian concept of tonal organization. This I think you must explain.
There are essentially two kinds of tonal gravity. Vertical, that is, tonal gravity inferred by the chord, where the chord infers the tonic, and horizontal tonal gravity inferred by the scale, for instance, a blues scale.
His New York Times obituary describes it as
a way for jazz musicians to improvise in any key on any chord without sacrificing the music's blues roots.
His system does not use the major scale as the primary method of organizing harmony, and instead uses the Lydian scale, which ended up being very influential on Miles Davis with his modal jazz approach on Kind of Blue, which was the greatest selling jazz record of all time. His ideas of the Lydian chromatic concept have gained traction at some universities, like New England Conservatory, for example, but jazz in general has a long tradition of non-white theorist educators who have attempted to codify the language of bebop, like David Baker, for example, and of course, the absolute legend himself, Barry Harris.
I borrowed the diminished notes. Now watch.
Barry Harris is famous for his work with what some people call the bebop scale, or the major scale with an added sharp 5, but what he calls the 6th diminished scale.
Tomorrow, everybody should know all the 6 diminished scales. But see, diminished notes are weird notes. They say, move me somewhere. Yeah. And they really do. They say, move me.
His approach to tonal harmony is both idiosyncratic and also incredibly useful for jazz improvisers and anybody who wants to improvise within tonal harmony.
When you hit the major 7, watch. Now, we think of that as a complete chord, but really that chord is saying, that's what it says. See, a major 7th really is a 6 with 1 diminished note.
George Russell and Barry Harris developed their systems for jazz improvisers. But since jazz harmony is largely tonal, as well as a lot of European classical music, there is no reason why you couldn't simply adopt their systems to look at the music of Chopin, or Beethoven, or Brahms, or Mahler, or any 19th century European classical composer. It's just that nobody has done that before. And honestly, to me, it just makes a lot more sense to analyze Chopin through the 6th diminished scale than it does through figured bass.
We've only seen music from this angle, and it's been a white angle, and it's been a male angle, and together, not or, but white and male. And we've completely put everything else out. We've excluded everybody else. I mean, nobody should really sit there and say that this didn't happen. That's just what music theory is.
One very interesting exception to this is in Russian music theory, where there are actually a number of female perspectives.
The other music theorist is Valentina Khalopova. She's a good friend of Sofia Gubaidulina.
This is kind of a holdover from Soviet practice, which saw culture, like music, as more of a feminine activity, and so there is a long tradition of Russian female music theorists.
Gubaidulina, a contemporary composer, and her friend Khalopova came up with a way of analyzing her music, and she called it a parameter complex. She had different categories of ways of grouping together sounds, how you articulate sounds, dynamics, and other methods. Five ways of doing so.
In Holopova's theory, any musical elements can either be consonant or dissonant. So staccato, playing the notes short, might be a dissonant expression parameter, versus legato, playing them long and connected, that might be a consonant expression parameter. This is kind of a strange idea, thinking about articulation, how you physically play your instrument in terms of consonance and dissonance, but if you really think about it, there might be something to that.
She talked about it with respect to Gubaidulina, but you could easily expand that and just begin to look at all kinds of 20th century significant composers.
But the first thing to acknowledge is that music theory has a perspective to begin with, and that is actually kind of hard to wrap your head around if you're not used to it. So you remember when we listened to Ninge Ninge and compared it to Rag Shuddha Kalyan like 5 minutes ago? Good times. Acoustically, the melodies were similar, but there were two different music theories behind the performances. So yeah, you could say that Anuja was singing a descending major pentatonic scale, but that makes about as much sense as saying Kathleen Battle was singing the descending form of Rag Shuddha Kalyan. There is definitely something that gets lost in translation there, the same way when you translate something from English to Hindi, for example. Spoken language is not universal, and neither is music. Part 4, Major 7. Music is not a universal.
Now hold on, Donald.
There's this deep sense that music is somehow above culture.
You like music, don't you?
That music is transcendent, like mathematics. It's universal. Math is math.
Math is math.
Music is music.
Let's go to ancient Greece, to the time of Pythagoras.
Pythagoras is widely hailed in popular culture as the father of both mathematics as well as music.
Mathematics and music?
Music was taught as part of the quadrivium in medieval Europe, alongside astronomy, geometry, and mathematics. Music was number in time, geometry was number in space, and astronomy was number in space and time. That makes a kind of sense, right? Or at least that's how Europeans have traditionally thought of it. There was this concentrated push in 1960s Cold War America to make the language of music theory more like a hard science and less like an art, to return it to the mathematical purity of the quadrivium.
From this harmony in numbers developed the musical scale of today.
Composer-theorist Milton Babbitt would try and make testable statements about musical compositions, and Benjamin Boritz took that a step further and attempted to use formal logic to make meaningful musical statements. Not sure if he succeeded, but that does look impressive, I guess.
The Pythagoreans, with their mathematical formula, came the basis of our music of today.
The push to make music theory more and more objective had the effect of erasing any trace that it ever had a white European cultural perspective, because, after all, how can mathematics have a cultural perspective? It's just math.
Math is math.
People who want to believe in race neutrality, they want to believe in a colorblind society. Why do you always have to make it about race? Stop talking about race so much. It's not about race, it's just about good music. There's only two kinds of music, good music and bad music.
That is kind of impossible to do, because different cultures, ethnicities, and races might value different things in music, and also might not agree on what music actually is. Dr. Kofi Agawu points this out in his paper on the West African bell pattern. Imagine, if you will, a New World Order in which African approaches to rhythm pedagogy predominated in the American Academy. No one would be granted a music degree who could not dance. So yeah, I certainly would not be able to graduate from this academy. It feels kind of off, right? But for a West African musician, that might just be kind of common sense. Dance is essential for understanding the layered metric structure of many African styles, and it can also help with performance. This is backed by neuroscience. Studies show that body awareness and movement is essential for how all humans perceive metric structures. Embodied cognition of music is at the very foundation of rhythmic and musical understanding in humans. So why wouldn't dance be required of every musician? Like, seriously, why don't we do that? Philosopher Robin James calls the intentional separation of analysis from culture the epistemology of ignorance.
The practice that naturalizes the common sense intuition of the most privileged members of society as objective knowledge.
We see the separation of analysis and culture in popular media all the time. Like, for example, when conservative pundit Ben Shapiro explains why, in his estimation, hip-hop is not music.
In my view, and the view of my music theorist father who went to music school, there are three elements to music. There is harmony, there is melody, and there is rhythm. Okay. And rap only fulfills one of these, the rhythm section. And so it's not actually a form of music, it's a form of rhythmic speaking.
This argument is actually very old. It echoes a 1918 article entitled Jazz and Jazzism, which rails against the dangers of jazz.
Jazz is the brotherhood of those who, devoid of harmonic and even of melodic instinct, love to fairly wallow in noise. It is a manifestation of a low streak in man's taste that has not yet come out in civilization's wash.
I'll take that as a badge of honor. Now, we could show that Black American music like jazz and hip-hop do indeed use melody and harmony, but we don't even need to do that to show that Ben Shapiro's argument isn't great. Let's say, hypothetically,
so let's say, for the sake of argument,
there was a Ben Shapiro in a society that framed African ideas of music as objective knowledge. In this case, his
music theorist father who went to music school
went to the kind of music school that Kofi Agawu described. In this case, Ben Shapiro would not consider Bach chorales to be music because you couldn't dance to them. Dance is an essential quality of music, as everybody knows, as neuroscience proves, and so Bach chorales objectively are not music. Argument doesn't really make sense. It's a bad argument, but it's no worse than Ben's 100-year-old racist view on black music.
Much to my disappointment, there are still people in music theory, I wouldn't say who are white supremacist adjacent. They still believe it. They know they can't say it.
You'll very often see articles where Western music theory is framed as a tool for proving a piece of music's worth. That piece that we checked out at the beginning about Lady Gaga argues for Lady Gaga's genius using music theory and uses the stylistic practice of white Europeans as evidence of genius, like the raised leading tone. I'm honestly not sure how this is evidence of transcendence for a fun, popular song, but okay. Another article from the same author argues,
the reason Teenage Dream went to #1 and remains in radio rotation is that it's a textbook example of the excellence and supremacy of the rules of Western music theory.
So, yeah, it's right there. You don't actually have to look very far for evidence of white supremacy in music theory. William O'Hara points out that these kinds of articles, these think pieces, frame music theory as a kind of hidden knowledge that you can use to identify genius. O'Hara parallels this practice to the work of Heinrich Schenker, who used his theories of analysis in the early 20th century as a means of identifying genius in the works of Beethoven and Bach. Which means, that's right, everybody. It's time to talk about part 5/7, flat 9, sharp 9, flat 13. Heinrich Schenker, I guess.
If Beethoven is our exemplar for a music composer, Schenker is our exemplar for a music theorist.
Heinrich Schenker, 1868 to 1935, arguably the most influential music theorist in American music theory.
So in the United States, if you want to get a graduate degree in music theory, I know there are tens of you got to study the theories of Heinrich Schenker. American music theory has very deep Schenkerian roots. David Carson Berry traces the popularity of Schenker's ideas of music in America for a desire in the 1930s for more objective musical criticism, which bears more than a little similarity to pop culture think pieces which appeal to the supremacy of the rules of Western music theory today. They're both born from Schenkerian ideals.
He came up with ideas about how the structure of music theory plays out, from a background structure to then a middle ground structure and a foreground structure. So this background structure came in only a couple of varieties. It essentially had a motion from a tonic to a dominant to a tonic chord that could play out in 2 bars, or it could play out in 200 bars or 500 bars in a movement by Beethoven or Mozart.
Schenkerian analysis has a unique form of musical notation that attempts to identify the deep structure of what Schenker considered the great works of tonal music, what Schenker called the ersatz, the sound of scale degree 3 resolving to scale degree 2 resolving to scale degree 1. In other words, at their fundamental level, all great works of music are 3 blind mice. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but honestly, not that much.
He had a very short list of great composers. They were, of course, all white men. They were 11, I think some people say 12 in number. All German speaking except for 2, Chopin, who was a Pole, and Domenico Scarlatti, who was Italian.
If you want to learn Schenkerian analysis,
my name is Dr. Jacob Gran.
I highly recommend Dr. Jacob Gran's videos on YouTube. They're a clear and concise introduction to a very complicated subject that might help you better understand the works of tonal composers. I 100% recommend these videos. They are great.
He drew heavily on 18th century theories of melody.
When you watch these videos, though, you start to realize that the concept of figured bass is absolutely essential in understanding Schenkerian analysis, as well as the idea of continuo. It becomes clearer why there is figured bass everywhere in all of our music theory textbooks. It's because it's all a system designed to teach Schenkerian ideas from the ground up. It's actually pretty explicit in, the preface to this book, Harmony and Voice Leading. This book reflects the theoretical and analytic approach of Henryk Schenker. The book will provide a valuable preparation for the later study of Schenkerian analysis. The problem is that Schenker is not useful in understanding any other style of music besides Western classical music. You can't do Schenker to Meshuggah, for example, or James Brown, or Anuja Kamat's music. And even within the Western canon, Schenker does not do a very good job of explaining rhythm, or timbre, or any other musical element. Dance, if we're going to adopt the African worldview. We've built music theory from the very ground up with the idea that the only music worth analyzing and worth having a language of analysis for is the music that this mustache liked to analyze. And if you can't analyze music through his theories, then it isn't music. It's not worthy of your time. It's inferior. You can't do music theory to it. This is the legacy of Ben Shapiro and his
music theorist father who went to music school.
Western music theory has developed a language that attempts to show white culture's superiority over non-white cultures under the guise of objective analysis. It's all a system designed to show white supremacy over non-white culture. And if you think that's me being hyperbolic or speculative, no, that's exactly what Schenker set out to do with his theory of music.
He said very explicitly, I think of music like I think of people. I have a unified worldview. There's a hierarchy. White people are at the top. There's a hierarchy. The foreground is at the top. Also, the 11 or 12 composers are clearly at the top. And then he always used the word genius. Genius was code for white. It was also code for German.
In his essay, Schenker the Regressive, the conductor Leon Botstein would write,
"The fact that Schenker, an observant and active member of the official religious Viennese Jewish community, adhered to these views and propagated them indicates how deep-seated was the sense of German cultural superiority within German-speaking Europe and how widely it was internalized."
So the most controversial part is not saying that Schenker praised Hitler in a letter to his pupil Felix Eberhard von Kuba in May of 1933, 4 months after Hitler ascended to the chancellery. It's not that Schenker said, the Jews are the greatest enemies to Germany, and he was Jewish himself. It's not that he said, even Negroes think that they can govern themselves. No, it's not that he said these horrible things that the white race must annihilate these Japanese animals because they're Japanese. No, it's not that he said all of those things. No one's going to dispute that. That's all out there.
Karl Schachter, the guy who co-wrote this harmony textbook that we keep referencing, wrote that for Schenker, both his political and musical ideas were armaments in a cultural struggle that would eventually lead to a regeneration of both music and society at large in the German-speaking world. Whew, okay, now things are getting serious. Music theory's intellectual framework is built on Germany's cultural struggle of the 1930s. That's good. Karl Karl Schachter continues, Schenker believed that an aristocracy of some sort, at least in cultural matters if not also in political structure, would promote the selection and support of gifted individuals among whom the rare genius might emerge. That he was altogether wrong in this last view, I'm not prepared to say. Wait a second. Schachter agrees with Schenker. Are music theorists... Is music theory like a...
Our roots are white supremacist. We have created racist policies based on that simple racist idea that whites are superior.
Dr. Ewell is not the first person to suggest that ignoring Schenker's racist ideas is not an option. Leon Botstein would also say in his essay,
Schenker's notion of superior culture as an instrument for civilizing the rest of the world, when placed in the context of such forceful prejudices and contempt, demands scrutiny.
I have taught Schenkerian analysis. I know it very well. Always got A's, always liked it, and I completely shoved it all under the carpet for my career. That was a bitter pill for me to swallow. Think of how hard it is for someone to swallow who's invested way more than I have, and there are many. The people who have devoted their careers, their energy, their toil to a field don't want to see it uprooted. They don't want to see their work undone. It's very difficult for that person to look into a mirror and say, race exists, whiteness exists, we've been rooted in pushing whiteness, and whiteness has had the leg up this whole time. And there have been other non-white groups who have been greatly disadvantaged.
Part 6 minor. No, really, music theory is really racist. I interviewed Dr. Ewell back in early July, and since that interview took place, there has been some, shall we say, music theory that has happened. After his speech at SMT, the Journal of Schenkerian Studies at the University of North Texas published 15 papers in a symposium response that Dr. Ewell was not invited to participate in. Now, some of these papers were half-assed, to say the least. One was just a short paragraph, and one was somehow published anonymously, which is strange because, just ask any teacher if that's enough to get a passing grade on an assignment. You're gonna need to write your name on it, and you're gonna need to probably write more than one paragraph. Probably the worst offender in laziness, though, comes from a professor at the University of North Texas named Timothy Jackson, who quotes at length from the Wikipedia article on misogyny in rap music for some reason. I guess because Dr. Ewell isn't white. Accuses Dr. Ewell of black anti-Semitism and also of not bringing blacks up to standard, and also patronizingly dismisses the work of black musicians.
We can listen to their music with pleasure even if they aren't the supreme geniuses on the level of the greatest classical composers.
It's mostly an unhinged racist tirade, but more importantly, this guy quoted from Wikipedia, like at length. I don't even do that, and I make YouTube videos. Seriously, check the sources in the link in the description. There are a lot of them, and none of them are Wikipedia. Like, not to belabor this point, but can you imagine citing Wikipedia in a term paper or a thesis or dissertation? Like, does your teacher let you do that? Like, no, you don't. You don't do that, dude. Why the hell would we take you seriously? People were pissed and signed a letter that Timothy Jackson should probably be held to the same level of academic competence that high schoolers are, and also maybe not be such a racist douchebag personally to Dr. Ewell. And for some reason, Fox News decided that this would be part of the culture war now, as well as the National Review, who described Timothy Jackson's paper as
serious critique of that scholar's work, based on archival research within his highly specialized field, and after lifelong study of Schenker specifically, and music theory more generally.
Again. Wikipedia. The very first thing that you see when you type in, is Wikipedia a reliable source, is Wikipedia telling you that it is not a reliable source. Man, Timothy Jackson, you're just killing it, dude. Just killing it.
I heard the quote where blacks have to, you got to raise blacks up to standard so they can compete, which I'm like, oh my God, you couldn't even say that in like 1970.
So the unfortunate side effect of the cartoonish levels of racism coming out of the University of North Texas this month is that this whole thing has turned into a referendum on Heinrich Schenker, who, one, you probably just heard of today, and two, was just some racist anti-Semitic guy living in Europe at the turn of the 20th century, and let's be honest, he was not unique in that regard. The fact that Fox News desperately wants to turn this into cancel culture run amok is just, It's just stupid.
Phil wants to, quote unquote, cancel Schenker. I don't, never said it, kind of said exactly the opposite at the end of my long article. Phil wants us to throw away Schubert and never play Schubert anymore. Nope, never said it, wouldn't say it. Schubert was a very interesting composer. I like quite a bit of his music. It's not about canceling anybody. It's about addressing difficult issues directly, forthrightly. We're going to talk about it openly. We're going to talk about white supremacy, the roots in white supremacy. I mean, that's a statement of fact. It's not under question.
Yeah.
Music theory is historically rooted in white supremacy. The music theorists said it themselves in the 19th century, quite openly. It wasn't a secret. It only became a secret when white supremacy became untenable in the mid-20th century. You couldn't be white supremacist anymore. It had to go underground.
Part 7 diminished. Coda. So where do we begin here? Well, the first step is in acknowledging that music theory is profoundly Eurocentric and white racially framed, and we already kind of have done that. In the beginning of this video, I asked you to replace the phrase music theory in popular media with the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians, and hopefully that got your wheels turning a little bit. Now, sometimes people genuinely are not referring to that style when they say music theory, but more often than not, they actually are. There's nothing wrong with the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians. I like the music of Bach, it's a big part of me. That does not mean that it has to be the default. The music theory of Heinrich Schenker also might be very useful in understanding the music of Bach and Mozart and Beethoven, and honestly, the musical notation looks freaking sweet. But that doesn't mean that his worldview has to be the default. And in fact, let's not adopt any of his worldview, please. So this video is already way too long, but I do want to mention a couple of things that have been glaringly omitted from the script so far. The first thing, of course, is the relationship of music theory to class. It costs money to go to music school, and not everybody has the ability to go to music school, the place where you learn this harmonic style of 18th century European musicians, and so knowledge of music theory can be kind of a class signifier. In the United States, anyway, the relationship between class and race is very clear, so this white racial frame of music theory affects class as well. Now, you might notice also that I've been talking about the United States primarily in this video, which is rather ironic in a video about the Eurocentrism of music theory, but I can only personally speak to my experience. And in my experience, I did not learn the music of Beethoven through the lens of Barry Harris and George Russell, people of color. Instead, I learned figured bass, which is all a system designed to teach Schenkerian analysis, which was a theory explicitly designed to teach German cultural supremacy. I didn't learn the basics of Ottoman or North Indian or Japanese or African music theory as a foil to Western theory, and I certainly did not learn how to dance in music school. I don't imagine my teachers were explicitly white supremacist in their view of music theory. Well, most of them anyway, but that doesn't mean that the system itself that they had to work with wasn't structurally biased towards the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians. And that's what makes racism structural. Sorry to bring in the critical race theory, by the way. I know if you're watching this now, you might be on some kind of future blacklist for anti-American activities, but here we are, everybody. Institutional racism is a bitch, and music theory plays a part of it. Here is me eating Fritos.